There we go.
Hey,
We have Samuel.
I do have on my screen, you guys are blocking some of the picture. Is that going to happen to you?
no.
No.
Okay, good. All righty. Well, I thought I would review this because this is, you're not, it's been a long time. Yes. And it's very important for understanding what's being said in these books. So this is how the scholars think that Samuel came to be. It seems to have been assembled from separate resources, which causes repetition, contradiction, and contrasting points of view. The first combining of the whole story is thought to have taken place during King Josiah's reform, which was 640 to 609 BCE. King Josiah was a boy of 8 when he became king, and he had actually been hidden by the priests in the temple so that his, I think, reigning uncle wouldn't kill him. That uncle was so bad that the people took him out of power, and so he was crowned in that uncle's place. When Josiah was 18, he allowed the priests to count all the donations in the temple, and then he gave the money to the woodworkers and masons for renovating the temple. And this is because these workers who were doing the renovation were more honest than the priests, I guess. The implication is that the priests were not to be trusted. But during the renovation process, the high priest, Hilkiah, announced that he had found a book of law in the house of the Lord and ordered a scribe to take the book to Josiah, and the scribe read it aloud to the king. And the scholars believe that the scroll, Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy, the second book of law. And they also believed that it might have been written during Josiah's reign.
I can't see it, so I don't think they could.
Can you see? I heard some comment there. Okay, so the editors supported, those people who wrote that book supported nationalism to the point of recommending genocide for enemies. And they endorsed both the monarchy and a strict obedience to the commandments of God. Okay, that was their general approach. So what was the theology of the editors? It was do well by God and choose people, and the chosen people will prosper, do poorly and expect God's wrath displayed in the destruction of the country. And there really wasn't much of an in-between. These editors were known as the Deuteronomists, and thus the book of Samuel is known as a Deuteronomistic history. How many syllables is that anyway? 6-syllable word. Good job. So as we read this book, we'll come upon places that seem disjointed. So what are we supposed to do with all of this? When we stumble over a contradiction, like the difference of opinion over the value of the monarchy, or conflicting titles for Samuel, or differing estimates of Saul or David. And we have had 3 stories so far about Saul being anointed several different ways, or becoming king in several different ways. And so that's the combining of all these stories. So they're just things that just don't seem right. It doesn't seem very smooth. This is the solution. Carol Gizzard would advise us to look for a literary purpose in those contradictions. What we have now is not a series of separate stories loosely strung together, but a careful editing of a work using reiteration and changing to illustrate, or changing point of view to illustrate the depth of the characters and the complexity of the action. A second, more literary editing probably occurred during the exile in Babylon in 550 AD. Thus, with the fall of both Israel and Judah, there would have been a deep skepticism of the value of kings for both Israel and Judah. And it appears in Samuel's farewell address, which is where we will begin today. Okay. Following the victory at Jabesh Gilead, this was the city that was attacked by the Ammonites, who intended to put out the eye of anybody who surrendered, because they were trying to take over the country and literally move their people into it, not have to deal with a population already there. And so Samuel gathered all the tribes and they attacked and they won. So he did exactly what he should as a king, and why fulfilled the role that the people selected that they have a king at all fulfill. Mm-hmm. And as soon as he had done that, Samuel says, we need to go to Gilgal and renew the monarchy. So this is either the third or fourth time that he's been made king. Gilgal was the place where, or should have been the place where the people crossed the Jordan River to enter Israel. And there they mounted made a circle of stones out of rocks that came out of the center of the river because it opened for them to cross. So it is a very special place, a national place, and a good place to celebrate a new regime. At Gilgal, they made Saul king in the Lord's presence, and they offered sacrifice of well-being, and Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration there. And then Samuel speaks to the gathering as he retired from national leadership. He was no longer going to be the one who did the political and warlike decision-making. So he's out of it, and he's announcing his departure, which is a very good thing. I don't know how many of you have worked in places where your CEO or your principal or whatever was leaving. It happens in churches all the time. And, it's a good thing for that person to talk about the leaving and then to actually leave. Around and cause trouble. And Samuel's going to say that he's retiring, but you have to wonder about that. So I've served you since my youth, and I am old and gray, and here we are before the Lord. Testify against me if you can. And in doing that, he's actually inviting God to this ceremony. So how many of you, now you may complain about me if you can, and God will hear. Testify. Did I ever defraud you or take a bribe from you? And the people shouted, no. And you are a witness before the Lord that I have served you well. And the people said, we are your witnesses. Then Samuel said, let me remind you of who you are. I declare to you that the Lord brought you out of Egypt by appointing Moses and Aaron. Now he's giving them their history, but he's also helping them to relate to all of that history, and so they'll have a moment here for recognizing what is new, which would be King Saul, and what is required of them in the presence of God and and what is required of them to God, to show respect to God, and what is required to show respect to Saul. So the Lord settled you in this place, and this is the crossing of the Jordan, where the river stopped flowing, which is a good thing to mention when they're in Gilgal. And then he describes the time after they arrived when there were challenges to their country, and how God continued to defend them with a judge, a person, a charismatic leader raised up by God to organize the army to defend the country. When you forgot the Lord, so the Lord allowed Sisera, commander of King Jabin, to defeat him, and later the Philistines and Moab, the king of Moab. So these are three different times when the country was overrun, and he's saying that this is all at the Lord's hand because you guys weren't being good and loyal citizens of God. And when you repented and put away your Baals and your Astartes, then the Lord rescued you, sending Jerubbaal and Barak and Samson. So if you fear the Lord, serve him, heed his voice, and follow his commandments. Okay? And if your king does the same, all will be well. This is Deuteronomist theology. And if you rebel against the Lord, then the Lord will stand against you and your king, which is ultimately what did happen. They were captured. This is the people marching out of Jerusalem and heading toward Babylon. However, if you choose a king, however, you have chosen a king, and that was wicked. Now, he thinks that God should be king of Israel and that you should just keep on going and let God choose leaders as needed. And the people have said they want a king, and so here's Saul. Now, here's how wicked that was. At that moment, God seemed to agree by sending a lightning strike and thunder with rain, and this was in the middle of the dry season, possibly ruining the wheat crops that were ripe at the time. And the people said in fear, "We have been wicked in asking for a king. What shall we do now?" I just wonder how Saul's feeling about this particular speech at this point. Do not fear. You have done evil, but the Lord will not turn aside. Serve the Lord with all your heart, and the Lord will not cast you away. Because it has pleased the Lord to make you his people. Remember the great things the Lord has done for you and serve him. Forget to do this, and you will be swept away, both you and your king. So I'm not sure anymore, but I think this is the fourth time Saul had been made king. And I believe the word renew, when he said, "Let us go renew our vows" in the Bible, had been added by some editor to try to blend this account into the series of anointings already within the same book. This is the official end to Samuel's rule and the end of the period when Israel was ruled by judges whose charismatic leaders like Samson and Gideon were chosen by God to meet whatever crisis arose for Israel. Now, Samuel's farewell address hardly compares with any inaugural address that we would expect to hear at the start of the new reign. How do you suppose it was received by the audience, the people Samuel is going to try to rule? How would you feel about this new era in Hebrew politics? And how do you suppose Saul and his supporters felt about this speech? I think it would be our right to think of, the kind of attributes that Saul had would be a lot like Trump. He would be very jealous of power and very willing to cast under the bus anybody who opposed him. So what do you suppose Saul is doing while Samuel's giving his speech? Imagine his facial expressions. But anyway, any guesses? It's time for you. Are you all muted? Can I unmute you?
I'm not muted.
Oh, okay. So
I
unmute
muted
yourself.
myself.
Some of us have chosen to mute ourselves.
Well, okay. If Trump were standing there and Saul gave this kind of speech, how do you suppose he would react?
He would be tweeting in all caps.
Yes.
Well, not today. He's been
No,
banned.
but yes, he would have. And he would have put some nasty comments about the person speaking.
We'd be doing some flailing imitation or something to disrupt the speaker.
Body language.
Yeah, based on that debate that he had. Is Samuel right to do what he's doing? To speak in that way?
I'm not sure he's speaking for the council. There was a council of leaders that would make decisions. And I think the nature of a council making decisions is long, laborious, and tedious.
Yes.
We think if we have one person making the decisions, it's going to work better. We lean to authoritarianism in making it simpler, but council decisions are usually better made and logical and have a lot more insight in them. With the Israelites, they wanted something a little easier. And I think that's a historical thing if you look at the history of mankind.
Sure. They were very concerned about the lack of the ability to immediately respond to a threat when an army crossed the border, because they didn't have a standing army. So they'd have to organize before they could respond. And one thing that Saul does do is have a standing army ready to respond. Is this what God wants for the king and the priest of Israel? Is this the relationship he wants them to have?
Well, they need Saul's army, and they keep it's Saul who is king, right?
Yes.
And they keep saying he's king again. Maybe every time his army has to act, they say he's king, so he could instruct the army to act.
He is king. He has been king. This is
But they keep renewing his vows,
Yeah.
And maybe that's for a reason. It's before he acts that he has to say he's king and can do this. Just a thought.
Yes, it is. It is.
From that, what Diane said, it seems like they cared more about defense of Israel than the relationship with God. It seems like that. So the king seemed like God wasn't center anymore. It was fighting
For Israel.
And always, even when David is king, and he's clearly a king who respects God, the real king of Israel is whom? It's God. The king is the God's servant, but never king in the sense of any of the other countries around where the king is God. But here, there's a God and there's a human king. So, so there's a problem. It's going to be a sticky issue because the relationship between Saul and Samuel will continue to grind to a halt. And that's what we'll see next.
I think that's one of the wise things in the church is the fact that when a priest leaves a parish, they have to leave the parish. They can't continue to be and I think that this may be the root of that decision, but I think it's pretty wise. I've watched in the business world when the outgoing president, CEO, whatever, just doesn't leave. They're just in the background. They're still a member of the organization and they still, it's tricky.
Yes, and it's hard on everyone. It's hard on everyone because it's hard for you to figure out which master to serve is what the problem turns out to be.
Yeah.
Okay, so a Bible seems to be like, completely whole and ready to go, and everything in it seems to be fine. But this is what it says in the Bible for this section of story. It says, Paul was ... D, which is the footnote, years old when he began to reign, and he reigned there's dots around that 2 years over Israel. Well, of course he didn't reign 2 years over Israel. So what's going on? The footnote under D reads, the number is lacking in the Hebrew text. The verse is missing in the Septuagint. The Septuagint was a Greek translation of the Bible that was a little bit before the birth of Christ, but it was the Greek translation that people like Matthew used to write their references to the scripture, because I don't think Matthew actually read Hebrew. The footnote under E, it says 2 is not the entire number. Something has dropped out.
0.
This is important only because it shows that the biblical manuscripts are very, very old and not usually in the best of conditions, and it makes translation hard. Some Bibles guess at what is written using other sources, like Septuagint. The CBE, that would be the Christian or Common English Bible, that is the one which we're using for our church services these days, writes in this place that Saul was 30 and he ruled for 42 years. But sometimes the Bible admits that they don't know. The problem with Saul being 30 is that he has a son who's leading warriors, and it seems more like his son must be around 30. So that adds an issue. Okay. So Saul was more of a warrior than a king. He had no capital, no throne, and no palace. He lived with his troops in tents or near his troops in the homes of the wealthy, behind a walled city that would likely become a battlefield soon. So that was him. He didn't really have a throne room. And then we're here at the Battle of Mikmash. Saul had 2,000 warriors with him at Mikmash, and his son had 1,000 at Gabay. It may be more like 300 and 100, but you don't know. These things are stories. Now Jonathan defeated an army of Philistines at Gabay, and it meant that the Philistines would start an all-out war to show Israel had more strength. And Saul called tribal volunteers from all the tribes to join Saul at Gilgal. The Philistine crossed the border with 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen. Again, it's probably an exaggeration, but still. Israel did not have enough warriors to withstand this army. And combatants and old men and women and children hid in caves and holes and rocks and tombs and cisterns, and some fled across to the Jordan. Okay. So that was the situation. Let's put this aside. And
I have to head out.
okay.
Bye, Diane.
Bye-bye.
Is it time to quit? I think probably is, isn't it?
It's 10:40.
Okay. Do we go to 11 or just to 10, a quarter to 10?
I think we go to
It
court.
always was 11.
Is it 11? Okay.
Half an hour.
Okay, good. I thought I had the wrong one. Hold on. Here we go. Okay.
There we go.
Saul was told to wait for Samuel, and he did for 7 days. But after 7 days, Samuel had not come. The longer they delayed the battle, the fewer soldiers Samuel had. They were slipping away into the night, too afraid to fight. So Saul said, "We've got to get this battle going. Bring me the burnt offering here to me and the offering of well-being." Now, this was done by all of the other kings around him in all the other nations. They were both the high priest and king, but Saul is not the high priest and the king. And so that's going to become an issue. Saul offered the burnt offering. However, as soon as he finished, Samuel arrived, and Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul explained that Samuel was late, and they needed to attack before his whole army melted away in fear. So what exactly has he done? In military terms, who is right? If you were Saul, would you have done this?
I think in military and political terms, Saul is right. He's losing his army. He's got to take action.
Mhm.
Theologically, we've got the former ruler, now the priest, who theologically needs to be the one making that offering, but he's not there to do it. I think he's between a rock and a hard place.
And of course, what would be the rebuttal? What would be what would Samuel say to him? Don't you trust God? God's going to handle this. Why do you think it's all on you? What's wrong with you?
Yeah,
Pardon?
there's more of a dimension than just military and political. There's a broader dimension to the whole issue of preserving Israel.
Yeah. And the only, as far as Samuel's concerned, you don't have to worry about timing because God is going to do the work if you trust in God, which he thinks.
It would have been different if Samuel had retired as priest. as well as leader, and a different person was in the religious leadership, I wonder if there would have been less of a battle.
You know, I think in terms of the Christian church, divided between the Greek Orthodox and the Romans, and one of the major sources of complaint with each other was that the Greek Orthodox Church subordinated itself to their emperor in the Eastern Roman Empire. And in the Western Roman Empire, the Pope and the emperor were constant loggerheads. One was constantly seeming to seize political power or religious power, and they fought constantly. And one of the reasons the two churches couldn't combine was because the Pope wasn't going to take a secondary role to an emperor, which would have been one of the conditions of reuniting those two. So what we have is more of a Roman type of situation here. Samuel said, "You fool, you've broken your vows of kingship, promised before God." Now, we've never had a copy of what those vows were. We could say, maybe we could look in Deuteronomy and find them, but Samuel was supposed to have written them up, and he was supposed to have read them and agreed to them. And I'm pretty sure he did break them. The Lord would have established your kingship over Israel forever, and now your kingdom will not continue. In other words, you know, it'll be his kingdom until his death, but his son, Jonathan, is not going to be the next king. The Lord will seek a new man to be king, one who will put the Lord's wishes and commandments first. So that's what the king of Israel needs to do. Theoretically. Samuel left, and Saul marched toward the battle at Gabay in Benjamin. And when they say in Benjamin, they're talking about a particular territory, a tribal boundary where Gabay is, like a state in the United States. Okay? So things are not going well for these guys. Okay, so this is actually titled in my Bible, Saul's Rash Promise or Saul's Rash Oath. This portion. Okay. Now Saul had committed a rash, not well thought out act. He made a promise to God the morning before a battle that no one in his army would eat food before sunset. And he prayed that if this was done, God would give them victory. Now, it could be that he's trying to crawl back into God's favor after he screwed up with the sacrifice. Maybe that's what's going on, but he's, who knows? Now, he said, this is even though his army needed all the energy they could get. So why did he say this? Oops, back up. Could it be to suffer for God? If you suffer for God, you might win more of God's support. So why didn't he feel he had enough of God's support without suffering? Could it be that he was testing his power and authority? So why might he need this kind of assurance? So what does this say about Saul's character if either of those are true?
I think he was insecure.
Yeah.
And, he just didn't know what decision to make.
Exactly. He could have been, yeah. Also, he's the commander of an army, and sometimes people who are commanding just make an arbitrary decision just to see if people are going to follow them.
I'm not really a fan of putting terms on God's blessing. So if we win, even though we've starved ourselves, then God is in it. It's contrived.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's
Saul's thing.
Pardon?
It was Saul's thing. This is what Saul did.
Right. So it shows an immaturity in his understanding of God, a big hole where he should have more, whatever, more trust, more experience. There is a possibility, Saul went crazy, would have fits of total insanity. And some would say that this might be the first sign that he was cracking up. Okay? So later that day, some of his troops came upon a honeycomb, and though tempted, they did not eat the honey. Now, Jonathan had not heard about his father's oath to God, so he ate the honey and he felt refreshed. The Bible says his eyes brightened. Only after he had eaten did his soldiers tell Jonathan about Saul's oath before the Lord. And Saul replied, "How much better if today the troops had eaten freely, then we would fight better." So, could Jonathan be right? Should Jonathan have spoken what every soldier must be thinking? Why might Jonathan have been better off not commenting on his father's oath?
It
When I
undermines.
was chaplain go ahead.
Well, it undermines his the commanding officer of his authority.
Not good for the morale to question the commander's decisions.
Especially a high-ranking person like his own son,
Mhm.
who would be probably the only person who would dare to do it. I know when I was at St. Anne's, there were things that we didn't call him principal. What do we call him? Anyway, headmaster, or the head of school would say, and I would go, "Oh man," but I was sort of like maybe fourth in command at school, and I certainly didn't want to, reveal any of my personal opinions about what happened. It was just not going to happen. And I'm sure there have been places in your life where you've done the same thing. How many of you have experienced that?
Why did the soldiers wait until after he had eaten to tell him this if he didn't know?
He probably grabbed it and swallowed it before they even had a chance. I'm sure they weren't trying to to get him in trouble. I don't think that could be a possibility, but I don't, from the way the story is, I don't think that is there. Let's look from the viewpoint of the editors, the persons who've had a chance to put this scroll together and then to re-edit it in Babylon. What purpose does this comment serve?
I don't know. Saul may not have been a great leader, but Jiminy Christmas, could he catch a break? Samuel's trying to tell him how to be king. Jonathan's undercutting his authority. You know, the guy should just throw his hands up in despair and say, off with it.
Yeah. So, you know, you could feel sorry for Saul.
I feel sorry for Saul. I mean, he might not have been perfect. He might not have been good at what he was called to do, but certainly nobody's helping him any.
You know, and I you know, sort of thinking over his entire career, at least Saul never backed down. He did his job to the very last. He may not have done it in the way God wanted. He may not have done it the way Samuel wanted. He may not have done it the way Jonathan wanted. Certainly not as David wanted it. But he didn't quit. You know. What do you think, Charlie? You know the whole story. So, okay. And this brings us to where we'll probably start next time, because to get into this story would be too difficult. But let's look at the map. This is the Jordan River, and this is Gilgal, or they think that's where it is. There is a circle of stones there that's old and old and old. So they're thinking that this is that place. And you've got to, it's a day's march from, oops, let's go back. It's a day's march from here to Jerusalem, or a day's travel. We have that in the story of the Samaritan, and maybe a little less. The battle is at Mikmash. Here's Gabay, here's Gabay. And Gabay was where Jonathan's already defeated whatever force they met that were Philistines. And so they've retreated to Mikmash, but they are not defeated. The opening of this, they're going to show that the commander of whatever force was here that was Philistine sent a raiding party to Oprah, another raiding party out here, and still another two probably down in here. So he's divided his army. He's not at all fearful of anything that might happen with the retaliation that or with the attacks of that puny little army that the Israelites can muster when he's got all these chariots, all the metal. He's got metal on his side, whereas at this point in Israel, neither Saul and Jonathan are the only ones who have metal armor and a metal shield and even metal points on their spears. We're talking about flintstone versus metallurgy, which is what the Philistines brought to the battle. And they certainly don't have chariots. So if I were the commander of the Philistine army, I think I pretty well had this thing under control. Of course, he doesn't know about God. Gonna have to happen. And this will be probably where we start. This is where he sends out all the different units to do more damage in all these places and keeps a quarter of them here. So Mikmash, by the way, means hideout or concealed space, place. And the Philistines sent out the 3 raiding parties. And so we're set for an interesting conflict. On the big map, Mikmash is about here. Okay. So thanks for being with me today. We'll continue next time if, if you like.